I suppose there's, why economics and then why the sort of economics that I do.
Mm.
So I think I chose economics because I suppose for personal reasons. I'm an only child, and like amongst my sort of extended family and my cousins, I was the baby. So I was kind of socialized in a very adult environment. So like even when I was in primary school, I was kind of interested in politics and to some extent public policy as well, which is kind of weird for a child, I suppose. So I suppose when I was once I sort of got to kindergarten, I suppose in New South Wales you call it preschool. I was sort of curious about the way the other kids behave. Like it didn't really make sense to me. So I've always been interested in why does people behave the way that they do, and that's really fundamentally what economics is about. It's not about neoliberalism or anything about that. It's just the study of how people and institutions make decisions under constraints. And the constraints part is quite important because if you don't have constraints, you don't really need economists, right? Like we could all just do whatever we want to do, whereas economics is about how do you do the best with what you've got. So when I went off to, I was pretty good at economics in high school. And then I don't know if this program still exists, but in Victoria, in the late 90s, there was this thing called enhancement studies where you could go and study a first year university course as part of your Victorian Certificate of Education. And there was like a little bit of a mark premium you got for doing that. So when I was in year 12, I sort of got to do first year economics at Monash, for which I ultimately got credit for as well. So I think it just sort of made sense that that's what I would do with my life. But specifically what type of economics I was going to do, that wasn't sort of obvious. I was definitely more interested in micro than macro. But I also found like financial econometrics quite interesting as well. But when I got to my honours year, there used to be this organisation called the Ronald Henderson Foundation. So Ronald Henderson was a famous, I think he was born in Britain, but migrated to Australia, and he was like a professor at the University of Melbourne. He founded the Melbourne Institute for Applied Economic and Social Research. And he's probably most famous for doing this big study into poverty in the early 1970s. So after his death, there was a bequest to fund these honours scholarships. So you got $5,000 while you were doing your honours year, which back in the mid-noughties was a reasonable amount of money, certainly for a student. But the condition was that you would have to go and do a research project with a non-government organisation. Okay. So I was sent off to work for these guys in St Kilda who were like property managers for a type of social housing called transitional housing. So some social housing is like, your stereotypical giant concrete box where people get to live and they're charged a certain percentage of their income support payments, because practically everyone who's in public housing is on income support. But then there was this program called transitional housing, which was sort of more intended for people who were disadvantaged but were sort of in the process of sorting their lives out and wouldn't need social housing for a particularly long period of time. So that's sort of your mothers escaping domestic violence, your people with alcohol and substance abuse issues who just need sort of a bit of breathing space to sort themselves out. So I was kind of sent off to work with these people knowing nothing about housing, not a great deal about social policy either. But what I did know a lot about was data and what you do with it. So after talking to them, they were sort of interested in, like, why is it that some of their clients, their tenures break down really, really quickly? Why is it some people stay in transitional housing for a long time? So I was able to apply this statistical technique called survival analysis. So this is something that economists, we're good at stealing methodologies from other fields. So survival analysis is something that engineers use to look at if you got like a production process and there's components and you want to know how long that component's going to last before it wears out. Or if you're a medical researcher and you're evaluating a drug or a particular surgical procedure, you want to get a sense of whether that prolongs the life of the people who got the procedure versus those who didn't. You can kind of so economists use this technique to look at, the reason why I knew what this was because economists use this to look at long-term unemployment. So for a lot of people, they don't stay in the state of unemployment for particularly long. There's some people who, become long-term unemployed. So this is a statistical technique that sort of allows you to sort of better understand. And it occurred to me that you could apply that to housing tenures as well.
Oh, okay.
So when I did that, when I got them to, because they were just working with pen and pencil, right? Like, when someone moved in to one of their properties, someone filled out a form and then someone updated that form and they left. So I'm just like, if you can digitize that, I can use econometrics to tell you a lot about these people and help you run your organization a bit more efficiently. And that was kind of the first, because up until that point, I just thought, well, you use econometrics to try and manage risk or forecast for economic indicators. It just sort of occurred to me, you could actually use it to look at what happens to individuals, like looking at macro data on survey data rather than just macroeconomic indicators. And so, I just thought that was really, really interesting. And then I decided to pursue a career looking at social policy rather than other areas of economics.
Oh, that's fascinating. Is that so that what I get from that is that it sort of seemed like the career or the path that you ended up taking was it was forged as part of the process. While you're in uni, opportunities arose and you decided to pursue them for whatever reason, or you were forced to or encouraged to, or it was the standard, as opposed to when you're in the first year of your program, what you'll be what you're working towards, what your career. It's more the former, where you're enthusiastic about this field and you're taking various opportunities, but you don't know exactly what type of job awaits you down the track, or what type of, is that a correct characterization?
Absolutely. I don't think there's that many people in the first year of their degree who know. A lot of people haven't even figured out what they're going to major in. But amongst those who know what they're going to major in, I don't think anyone knows exactly what they want to do straight after university. I think those people are definitely in the minority. So I chose a path that was less lucrative, but I think a lot more interesting. So one of my best mates he did economics at University of Melbourne. He ended up a currency dealer at the Reserve Bank, and now he works at the Commonwealth Bank earning multiples of what I do. But I don't get a sense that his job is particularly fascinating. I mean, maybe he would argue that it is, but I don't think I'm having fun.
Excellent. And understood. I suppose that sort of is a nice segue into our next sort of question. Our audience is primarily high school students, year 11, mostly year 12. I suppose to help them, better understand what type of work economists do. You sort of alluded to this a little bit already, but for students, it can be a bit harder for them to envision, compared to, say, an engineer or an accountant or a doctor. In perhaps the most simplest practical terms about what your day-to-day work is like, or was like, perhaps when you were just starting out, and things like that.
So in terms of what I spend most of my time doing, that hasn't actually really changed that much since my first full-time job. My responsibilities have definitely changed, but a lot of my time is just spent trying to beat data sets into shape so I can learn something new about the world, I suppose. So a lot of my day is actually spent coding. But there's other things I need to do. Like, I've got to figure out what my research priorities should be. I've got to figure out exactly what my research question is, understand that within the context of the research that came before. Then I've kind of got to sort of map out some of it's sort of project management, like, what exactly is my project? How is it going to unfold? But because I'm a quantitative researcher, a big part of that is going to be, what data am I going to use? I suppose this might not be obvious to your students. When quantitative researchers are working with data, we don't just sort of get a nice file that we then get to play with, because the people who collect the data have usually designed their surveys to meet the needs of a lot of different users. So it comes to you, and often your data comes to you in sort of quite a raw form, and a lot has to be sort of done to it before you can actually analyze it, before you start doing the statistical analysis. So at the moment, I'm looking at differences in voting behavior between different generations and how that changed over their life cycle.
Okay.
Yeah. I've got a report coming out on this, so I can't speak too much about the findings. But basically what I had to do was, there's this survey called the Australian Election Study. And this is conducted by researchers at ANU. Usually the data is collected shortly after an election, when the election is sort of fresh in the minds of the people you're trying to survey. And this data was collected in sort of since the late 60s. There was a bit of a gap in the 70s, and then sort of from the 1987 election onwards. So I've got this survey data of different people, but like spanning quite a large number of years. So you can kind of get a sense of how people's voting behavior changes at different ages, but also for people who are born in different generations.
Oh, yeah, excellent.
So a lot of that is just going through, 20 odd data sets, making sure the measure that you're interested in is in all of those data sets, making sure that the numbers mean the same thing in every different data set. There's a lot of work that goes into that, but once you've built that thing, you can do a lot of really interesting stuff with it.
Yeah, that is definitely intriguing, because there are a lot of anecdotes or memes or just pop cultural jokes about, younger people tend to think this way or vote this way, but then as they get older, they tend to vote a different way. Am I sort of in the right ballpark of the sentiment that your research
the power of
is
data
unpacking?
It's now no longer anecdote. Like, people have views about Gen Z's views on this or how they vote. You need someone with a data set that sort of puts that.
Wow.
It can actually tell you, well, for a pretty representative sample of the Australian population, this is how things actually are. Or at least this is how the people who are willing to engage in the survey, this is, I suppose, the truth about them, if you will.
Yeah, being able to make it more empirical than just stereotypical views as to what older people always say or what younger people always say and who's right and who's wrong. Yeah,
and you might gain some insights that you wouldn't if you just spent all your time on Twitter or Instagram.
Yes. Yes, absolutely. Okay, I suppose another just natural progression into the next question, I guess, with the majority of our audience being, secondary high school students, the year 12 student who tends to really enjoy and love studying economics, or at least in high school, they also tend to enjoy business and accounting and finance and commerce and law and a bit of politics. There tends to be a bit of a nice Venn diagram, I suppose. Would you have any advice on any year 12 student who that subset of worlds is the type of world that they want to be in? Do you have any advice on a 17-year-old who's weighing up a commerce degree versus an economics degree versus politics philosophy against just business or accounting or anything like that? How would you advise younger you how to set your preferences or your uni choices?
That is a big question.
It is. And there's no pressure. There's absolutely no pressure.
Ultimately, people want different things. And I think what you might think you want at 17 might not be what you want when you're finishing your degree at 22. So I think keeping your options open is probably the best advice, a middle-aged person like myself could give to someone in their late teens. But in terms of like what discipline you should choose, like it really depends on what it should depend on largely what you're interested in.
Yeah. So perhaps
But
if I give you a
also,
bit of a high school version of a closed activity or a fill in the blank, where it's something like, if you're the type of person that really enjoys blank, then economics will be a right fit for you.
I think if you're interested in how the decisions of policymakers affect the economy and society, then I think you're probably the sort of person who would perhaps have more fun and feel more fulfilled if you chose economics or political science. I think if that's something you're interested in, you might not find accounting to be particularly fascinating or finance particularly fascinating. On the other hand, if you just, and there's nothing wrong with this, like if you just want to make heaps and heaps of money, and then, I suppose that gives you the financial freedom to retire early and to decide to, follow your passion, whatever that is, then, there's nothing wrong with a degree in law and a major in finance and trying to get into one of the investment banking grad programs. But they will work you very, 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 very hard. They will give you lots and lots of money. They will work you very hard, and the expectations are high. Like, you don't, if you're an investment banker who's not delivering value, you're not going to have that job for very long. Whereas I think in the bureaucracy, they're a bit more relaxed, rightly or wrongly.
Yes, understood.
So I can say I've had a pretty good work-life balance, I think, over the course of my career. And that's more important to me now that I have a son who turned 2 last week. And the money's fine. Like, I don't have anything to complain about. But if you need your mansion in Vaucluse, or you want your apartment overlooking Circular Quay, then you probably have to be a bit more pragmatic about a private sector career in banking, I think. Understood.
I'd love to circle back to the idea of fulfillment, but perhaps maybe I'll give you a bit of a break with one question before that. We have one question in the chat. Do you have any recommendations on reading or other resources for students who would like to know more about economics or social policies, or even to have an early taste of research? Is there anything off the top of your head that you could recommend to the budding enthusiast of economic and social policy?
It's probably an older book now. So I think it's Steve Levitt, Freakonomics. So that.
Oh, yeah, Freakonomics.
Yeah. So
I'd be surprised to think of anyone who hasn't heard of that who's over 30, I suppose.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking. Like that was sort of a big deal in the noughties, but I thought maybe I think like he had a podcast as well. But I think that book is sort of a nice and accessible taste of empirical research in economics.
Yes, I definitely, that was one of my formative. The book is Steve Levitt's Freakonomics. Yes, that's one of my favorites, definitely. Oh, is it possible? Did we lose connection? Are you still there? Matt?
It's just apparently our connection is unstable.
Oh, okay. Well, we can hear you. You're back now. The video not great, but we can hear you loud and clear. Yeah, Freakonomics, definitely. Absolutely. That's definitely a good recommendation that I haven't thought about in many years, but that's a good one. All right, perhaps I will mention to everybody in the audience that the chat is open. You are welcome to push through any questions that you might have that we'll be able to have a look. But perhaps one more from us. Would you be able to speak to, you mentioned fulfillment and work-life balance and things like that. Like reflecting back on your decade plus in the field in economics, doing research, what's would you be able to speak on the fulfillment? You look back on the work that you've done, and what are the types of conclusions you've come up with, the questions you've answered, or the questions you've come close to answering that have really, you know, that you're really proud of, you know, without being too corny, I suppose. Mm.
Connection between the work that you do and the policy outcome. Like if you're an investment banker and you're working on a deal or a takeover or whatever it is, then like that thing happens or it doesn't happen, and you know what your role in that was. When you work in public policy, you're sort of part of this gigantic
Oh, we apologize, everybody. All right.
Cool. We're back.
Yes, we are back. We are back. Okay, we might just start that one back from the beginning. So could you speak to, looking back on your career, would you be able to speak to the most fulfilling, or the types of work, the type of questions that you've pursued that have brought special fulfillment to you as you reflect?
Sure. So working in public policy is a little bit different to working in something like investment banking. Like if you're an investment banker, you know, you're working on a deal, it either happens or it doesn't. You're working on a takeover of another company, it either happens or it doesn't. And you know what is a bit different because it's sort of this big ecosystem of interests and research and the government, and often policy reform happens over sort of quite a number of years. So very few people in public policy get to say, you know, that reform happened and I've stamped my name.
Yeah.
So like probably the only obvious exception I can think of this would be Professor Bruce Chapman, who's Professor Emeritus at the ANU. He basically got to take credit for the introduction of the higher education contribution scheme.
Oh yeah. Yep.
Yeah, but that's sort of the rarity. Like, you know, an academic that can say I got that over the line that's very, very rare. But something that I worked on that I think ultimately had some influence on a policy reform was the work I did on age pension policy. So one of the, I suppose this might, I don't know to what extent your students would be interested in this, but it'll probably give you some insight into how public policy reforms happen.
Absolutely.
So in the 1970s, I think it was the Whitlam government abolished means testing for the age pension. So basically, it didn't matter how much wealth or income you had. If you reached the pension age, you got the age pension. And then in the mid-1980s, the Hawke government reintroduced it. So your pension entitlement was going to depend upon how much assets you hold. The idea being, you know, if you have a large number of assets, you can probably look after your own retirement. If for whatever reason you don't have a lot of assets, you're going to need comparatively more support from other taxpayers, which makes sense, I think. But one thing the Hawke government did at the time was to exempt your principal residence from that assets test. Now, at the time, this didn't necessarily matter so much because houses weren't didn't sort of cost that much at the time, right?
Yeah.
But what they decided to do was to sort of have a tighter assets test for people who were homeowners compared to those who didn't. And what that does is sort of put an implied value of home equity into the assets test. So at that point in time, the implied value of home equity in this means test was probably not greatly different to what the median house price was. But once you have a house price boom, housing affordability issues,
we're
now making age pension payments to people who are quite high net worth individuals.
Mm,
It's just a lot of their wealth is invested in this highly illiquid asset.
yes.
Now, there's two consequences of this. One of them is we pay far more in age pension payments than what we otherwise would if there was some way of means testing the principal residence. But I'd argue, perhaps more importantly, is there's also an equity issue here. Because, like, I would argue someone with the same net worth should be, two people with the same net worth should be getting the same age pension payment. The composition of
Mm-hmm.
your assets, the extent to which your assets are
Mm,
made of home equity, I don't see as being particularly relevant on equity grounds.
mm-hmm.
So sometimes in public policy, we talk about horizontal equity. You know, people in the same situation should be treated the same by the government, which is different from vertical equity, which is about how do we trade off the welfare of rich people versus poor people.
Yeah.
And that's what,
Yep.
I guess,
Understood.
shapes a lot of people's views on taxation policy.
Yeah.
So yeah, me and a colleague of mine wrote a report on that in my first stint at the Centre for Independent Studies in the early noughties. Sorry, not the early noughties. I think I was there sort of 2013, 2014,
Mm.
the early 2010s. And there was sort of a bunch of other think tanks that were sort of looking at this issue as well. And ultimately, that did lead to some policy reform in that space. It wasn't exactly what we wanted, but it was, I think, probably overall a positive reform nonetheless.
Mm.
Yeah. But yes,
Fascinating.
if you pursue a career in public policy, you can chip away at things for a number of years, and maybe something will happen, or maybe it
Mm.
won't. It's just the nature of the thing.
Yeah,
If you need
absolutely.
instant gratification, and seeing what your efforts will produce, then you might need to choose a different area of economics.
That's an excellent angle. I sort of now way back in year 9 and year 10 when students are choosing their senior high school, subjects, and they ask about economics, and my sales pitch for the subject or the if you're interested in is sort of I tend to frame it as solving the problems that may not have a solution, or at least not a perfect solution that everybody's happy with. And I think the intergenerational lens, I suppose, especially with means testing, people's homes and the differences between older Australians and younger Australians and the rich and the poor, that's an easy one to present as how could we possibly create change without significantly angering some group of stakeholders, and how do we weigh all of that up? So thank you for that. Okay. Yeah. Oh, sorry. Anything else?
Oh, I was just going to say that, yeah, like in public policy, the politics is always important.
Mm.
There's a lot of academics that get, and when I say academics, I mean people who've spent their careers at universities.
Okay.
They get frustrated and shouty on social media because they know what the right answer is, but the policymakers aren't listening. Whereas for someone like myself, who's had sort of a more diverse career, having worked at think tanks and worked a little while in the bureaucracy, getting things done is hard. And just because you think you've got the right answer doesn't mean that's going to get it across the line politically. And part of it is sometimes you have to sacrifice a little bit of the perfect to get something that's good enough for the political process.